oppivaan systeemiin ja oppivaan yhteisöön liittyviä pieniä työtä.
Okay, let's continue.
Sitten niissä on kuitenkin jos jollakin on kiinnostunut.
What you find there on the table, and we continue with Taru Elfving, who is a researcher and curator and writer based in Helsinki. And Taru's practice focuses on science-sensitive investigations at the intersections of ecological, feminist and decolonial thought. And she is currently developing a multidisciplinary platform on artistic research with the Archipelago Sea Research Institute of Turku University. And now, at the moment, Taru is also working for the university to somehow find and scrutinize some kind of practices we have here relating to the ecological thinking. Am I right? Yes. So, your subject today is ecologies in/of practice. So, please, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here. It sounds really weird to me. Is this sound alright? Yes? Oh, is there some sort of... No, it's here. This thing. Okay. Yeah? Alright. It's probably just in my ears. As said, I'm working for the University of the Arts now as well. I have my own independent practice as a researcher and curator. But I'm doing a project or sort of working as an expert, I guess, a researcher in a project called Sustainable Futures within the University of the Arts. And so I've been thinking a lot in my own practice, but now also trying to think in an institutional level. What does the ecological crisis mean for an institution and for our practices? And this is where I'm coming from also for this discussion today. And so I think there's really interesting sort of connections through the previous two talks. And I think my maybe approach is more of asking a lot of questions. So I'll probably leave with you with more questions than answers for sure. But I hope that will also lead for kind of good discussions later on. I'll start from Talvivaara. I went last weekend to visit Talvivaara, which is the most, for those of you who don't know, but lucky enough not to know, is a huge mine for nickel and cobalt particularly, but they're also unearthing a lot of uranium there in northeastern Finland. This is a site of the biggest environmental disaster in the Finnish history, or independent history of Finland at least, when about 5-6 years ago there was a massive leak into the waterways. The mine continues in operation. It went bankrupt, the private company. It was bailed out by the state, and the government promised to shut it down. They have never done that. The operations continue. And talking, this sort of ending the last talk with this notion of dark entanglement, I can very much relate to that after being in this site. So I'll start from here and see where we end up. I was there with a group of artists and researchers and activists. There was a 2-day sort of intensive workshop in Kajaani with a lot of particularly Nordic participants talking about extractivism. And we went also to visit this site. What you see there is a sort of a mound, like a big sort of a hill that has been created out of the waste rock that has been excavated. And this is most of what we saw was actually this. There is still a road that goes quite close to the mine, and the mine has been trying to close that road, public road, but they have not managed to do that so far. But you cannot see very much from that, because there's basically this, about the height of the forest, kind of a wall that follows along the road of all this excavated rock. And one artist friend of mine who's been doing a long work on Taru said that this, what we see here, for example, was not there a year and a half ago. So there's a lot of operation going on, but we don't really see that. I guess if we had a drone, that would have helped, but it didn't happen with us. But this is a site where you really you become really sort of painfully aware of the entanglements of everything that we do with the kind of unsustainable processes that are happening in the world today, and the economics, the politics of extractivism that are pretty much sort of beyond our control, it seems. Taru is a case where there's been huge amounts of activism, there's been huge amounts of professional, academic, experts analysis and research, and it has not stopped the project. And it keeps on basically changing the ecosystem of the waterways around it dramatically as we speak today. But of course, you know, this is just the top of an iceberg, so to say, of these projects. You know, at the same time, on the same weekend, I heard about, actually on that same day, on Friday, Norwegian government gave go-ahead for this massive new copper mine project that is going to be pumping all its wastewaters into a fjord in the Arctic Sea. That the Sami, particularly in the region, have been really working strongly against. And there doesn't seem to be any legal framework that will help in stopping that mining project. And there's numerous more. And so I think it's kind of why I want to start from here as well, is to think that is sort of emphasize that these are not just things that happen far away, they're actually very, very close. I also heard about gold mining that is being planned by Dragon Mining, that is a multinational, huge mining corporation, and this is planned for Valkeakoski, that is about an hour and a half drive from here. So these are happening very, very close by, but we don't even necessarily know about them. The stories don't get out very much, and we have no idea of the impact, and there seems to be no way of controlling this impact. And why this is really relevant for us today, I think, is that there I was, you know, afterwards I was sort of leaving from Kajani, I was sort of writing a text and posting it online, and just thinking of how this my posting it online on a train from Kajani to Helsinki is totally already implicated in the processes of all of these mining projects that are ongoing. It's all about technologies that have a very, very concrete material footprint, environmental footprint, that is right next door to us, or our own backyard, not just somewhere far away. And of course, I'm not saying that the far away should not be considered, but I think it is not just somewhere detached and sort of out of view. It's kind of out of view, but not really. You know, it's like when you're there, you can smell the sulfuric acid. So it's so I want to kind of start from there, of thinking about how our practices today are entangled very darkly in all kinds of very material, very concrete processes that are happening that are extremely complex. They're definitely kind of wicked problems like climate crisis, but we are entangled in that in ways that you cannot just go with the flow. There is a sense that I think we have this very, very strong need for us to really kind of think of our own implication and think of how do we develop our own practices in response to these sort of implications. And I'll show you a little bit. Let's see if I get this to work. Oh, tiny. This is a film that artist called Russell Eckley made together with Greenpeace in Kuusamo, a gold mine project. This was made a few years ago, but the project has not been, it's not ongoing at the moment, but it still potentially will start. I didn't have a drone to take you over Talvivaara. We got to see another mine, and this is just the test mining site, not the mine itself. It's not the mining project itself is not going in. And so the kind of different kinds of entanglements of animals, local livelihoods, particularly waterways are usually always involved because the mines need, for the chemical leaching projects, the way that usually mines operate these days, there's a lot of need for water and somewhere to pump the water in the end of the process. And so usually there is always a connection to waterways that then can obviously contaminate if there's any accident, or even sometimes it seems the legal framework for what can be that, a release in the waters is not enough for those quantities of water that is actually pumped into the waterways, so it spreads quite uncontrollably. And so what do you do? What do you do in this sort of situation as an artist, or as working with these questions? It seems that somehow the critical content of a lot of our work is out of sync with the technologies, with those frameworks within which we operate. We're kind of implicated at every step, we're somehow actually, also contributing these processes in need of different kinds of minerals, for example, for our technologies. But at the same time, I've come to recently particularly really appreciate the amount of information and insight that I've been only able to gain through artworks, and a lot of things that are happening in the world. That the arts are not just in terms of documentation, in terms of actually releasing information to us that otherwise would not be available, at least through mainstream media. It's also kind of engaging in ways, allowing us ways to engage with these processes that are happening in ways that otherwise, if you just read about Talvivaara mine, for example, in the media, it's just totally daunting. You don't feel that there's any sense you can engage with that. I also know of artists who work very closely with local communities and actually allowing these communities to voice their experience and their grief, and so on, and allow for that kind of sort of communities to form around the artwork as well, around these questions. So it's a really double-edged sword. If we don't make the work within our, we can go off the creek, but then we can have no impact on these things either. So there is a way of really, how do we negotiate that sort of entanglement? I was reading this morning about a new report that just came out from European Environmental Agency, a report that they release every 5 years. And one thing kind of stood out from there. It was quite a sort of tough reading, but what stood out from there was this focus on that we cannot just focus on making current technologies more efficient, but there are limits to where that can go. If we stick to what we know, it may seem easy, but it doesn't work in the long term. We cannot go carbon neutral by basically just tweaking and getting our technologies to work better. There's a kind of bigger shift that is needed. I'm sure many of you have been reading Felix Guattari and know this, of his thinking around through ecologies, but that has been something that for me has been really sort of presented here as a kind of background to my thinking and how I see the kind of environmental issues. How can we approach them? We have to think of them transversely. We have to think of how these different aspects kind of are interconnected. He wrote already in '89, was basically comparing the sort of mutant algae that is invading the lagoon of Venice with Donald Trump's efforts to basically kind of redevelop New York City. Obviously now we've seen that I think in today's perspective, the algae, it doesn't really seem fair comparison to the algae at all. But I think as a tool, this has been really useful for me, this sort of thinking of three ecologies, of how when we approach the environmental urgencies, that we can't just think about the environment. We have to think about what he calls interconnected ecological registers of the environment, social relations, and human subjectivity. So the kind of environmental, social, and mental ecologies. So in order for us to be able to change anything, we have to actually address all of these three and understand how they are kind of entwined in different ways and interacting in different ways. So it's not just that our relationship to the environment, the natural world is sort of somehow screwed, but actually that is also somehow very much kind of reflected in our social structures and our subjectivities today. And these are all what we need to change. So it is not only species that are becoming extinct, but also the words, phrases and gestures of human solidarity. We need new social and aesthetic practices, new practices of the self in relation to the other, the foreign, the strange. And I think here art is really, really important. A lot of scientists that I've been working with recently have been also emphasizing how important it is. They need art, you know, to kind of in dialogue with their science, to try to make sense of how do we actually tackle climate crisis today. How do we start understanding ourselves in relation to the issues that we face? But this comes with a lot of representational challenges, so to say. We have quite a lot of work now dealing with climate crisis and environmental questions. But how can sort of images, narratives, documents, how do we tell these stories? And what are the kind of, how do we balance these different things and allow for that kind of complexities at stake, in this sort of situation to somehow come out? Like Rob Nixon has been writing very important work around the kind of slow violence and asking how can we convert into image and narrative the disasters that are slow-moving, anonymous, and of indifferent interest with the sensation-driven technologies of our image world. And he talks about slow violence, that it's not just a question of catastrophes. What happens when there's a tsunami or when there's some sort of environmental disaster? There's a media focus for 5 seconds on that place, and then the focus is somewhere else. And there's a lot of course, climate crisis is not just the kind of catastrophic events, but actually a lot of very slow structural violence against people who are already disenfranchised to start with. Amitabh Ghosh, who I will come back to later on as well, writes about the climate crisis. The climate crisis is also a crisis of culture and thus of the imagination. And he kind of calls for us to really think of what it is, that why, writing in 2016, in a book called The Great Derangement, there's a really great book, came out, and he was sort of asking that why has contemporary art, literature, etc., why have they not dealt with climate crisis? And I think now there is a lot of work around this, but still in 15, 16, actually there wasn't that much, considering how much it was already in the news and political agendas. But about these sort of representational challenges then, and kind of my experience with Taru, for example, I was thinking that I really want a drone. This is probably the only first ever experience that I really wanted to have a drone, to be able to fly over and see, because I could not see what was there. At the same time, I felt kind of protected that I didn't have to see. But the kind of question of a scale of perspective, of how do we look, when we look from above, we see the scales, we see the kind of structures, we can see sort of structural patterns and so on, like in the kind of photography of Batursky. But that's been also, there's been critical, very important critical writing about this kind of perspective of how actually it becomes sort of sublime, and also these photographs end up being kind of bought by speculators who kind of hang them above their expensive sofa, in the kind of big banking districts of London and New York. So the kind of how does this sublime work, and how it sort of also supports a certain kind of belief in the kind of ingenuity of humanity and the human, and the kind of a lot of these sort of geoengineering fantasies, for example, that if we can do this, we can do that. What you see here is actually it's sort of greenhouses. Greenhouses of vegetables, etc. But there's another perspective, like Claire Pentecost, who's been photographing from a very different direction, and from a kind of human eyesight level. of how do we actually recognize, how do we, when we come further down to the ground, feet in the mud, then we start actually seeing how actually what is the what are the social power relations and conditions of people, for example, working in these greenhouses, for example. This is in both of these images are taken in Spain. So a lot of people working here are always illegal immigrants, people without papers, without any rights. They're producing our cheap tomatoes in our shops, in the winter time in Northern Europe. How do you navigate between these two different perspectives? Because we need both. We need to understand the structural and particularly the planetary. That is not just a local issue. The fact that if Talvivaara mine wasn't there, the mine would be somewhere else, even further away from our site. So, but then how do we at the same time somehow recognize the specificities in each context where these things are taking place? What are those power relations, how they're affecting people on the ground, and not just people, but all the environment around, for example. There's the sort of quite a badly, affected waterway, for example. And so here DJ Demos is one of these writers who's been very critical of particular kind of photography, for example, on the Anthropocene, and also critically writes about the notion of the Anthropocene. And he writes about kind of political ecology and how we have to think about ecology in political terms, and how environmental matters of concern are always connected to social, political, and economic forces. And these we have to somehow kind of bring together. And so in that sense, he calls for intersectional politics of aesthetics, where actually in the arts we can somehow draw these things together in a way that, for example, maybe in other media, in history, for example, you can't tell the stories at the same time from a kind of planetary, high above, God's perspective, and from the kind of ground up. How do we kind of bring those things together and recognize those different forces that are at play? Another example I thought I could bring up was then the question of when we start looking at something very concrete like oil. How do you tackle oil? How do you deal with the fact that we should keep this stuff in the ground? It's very much at the heart of a lot of the issues now, of everything unsustainable in our everyday life. Let's see if I get this to work. So here's, for example, a massive project where a territorial agency, a kind of collective of architects and researchers, work together with Purolatul, for example, on making this massive exhibition project called Museum of Oil, where they basically map the scale of what is involved in global oil production. Huge imageries, huge kind of mapping that gives you the kind of scale, the kind of global scale of what is at stake in the kind of in the economy, in the kind of on the ground. And it's a sort of space where you are bombarded by this sort of technological kind of sublime of what is happening. And there's John Valentino, who's one of the artists. Going back, but then so yes, it's really important that we understand this kind of this sort of how the territories are shaped by oil, like they write, and how do we? This is something that we need to understand in order for us to be able to disentangle ourselves from the kind of oil. But at the same time, we need somehow to kind of and go to the other extreme then, and start looking at also, that is looking at structures. It's very hard to somehow, although the territorial agency writes about this as something that we need this understanding in order to be able to disentangle ourselves from it, but it's very difficult to somehow see us in that landscape. How are our practices in these minute little practices that we have and impacts, how is that really connected? we can recycle even more, I'm sure, but in other terms. And so I'm kind of interested in how somebody like Brett Bloom, for example, an American artist working with also collective practice, has been writing about petrosubjectivity and how actually he claims that oil produces our daily selves, and our daily lives in every level. That it's really a kind of formative for our understanding of self and in relation to the world and others. And so how do we, in order for us to be able to really move on, we have to understand this, how much oil really kind of is sort of, in a way, forms us and our understanding of ourselves. He's done a number of projects around this, but for example, one is this deep listening work that he's been doing, where he's basically following Pauline Oliveros and trying to develop kind of methods of listening to our environments in different ways and thinking about how our understanding, how the kind of tuning in to our environments allows us kind of more maybe understanding of what is going on. But then he's also developed this, like the powerless PowerPoint, that I really like the idea. So this is a big canvas that is rolled up, and he cycles around, and he has this PowerPoint set up. It's basically a wood, with this sort of recycled material, things that have been printed with, the kind of ABC of the Anthropocene. And so it's kind of, first of all, in order to actually be able to go through this powerless PowerPoint, you need at least two people to hold the thing, and then you need obviously somebody to explain to you what's that, what it says. So it becomes a kind of collective exercise. In the same way that how he emphasizes the deep listening as a kind of collective exercise, that it's something that you do together. Even if this is about you tuning in, then it's very important to share and to discuss this, what you've experienced. And so what they kind of, what all of these artists are really kind of looking at is extractivism. A term that actually was the sort of title of this, or part of the title of this gathering in Kajaani, where I was last weekend. And the kind of and I think it is a very useful and very kind of necessary term today to start and try to understand of how it's not just about extraction of resources. It's very much connected to extraction of human labor. It's very much a question of extraction of care work, for example, that is unpaid and unrecognized in our everyday lives and in societies, etc. And here also the kind of, what becomes useful is the understanding of this notion of sacrifice zones that Naomi Klein wrote already a few years ago, of how the kind of industrial capitalism treats whole categories of our species as human sacrifice zones, no more deserving of rights than raw commodities. And this is, of course, globally very much the case. But actually somewhere like in Kajaani, in Kainu, I was really thinking about that, how it's also a sacrifice zone. There's not that many people there. It feels quite far away from Helsinki. We don't really see what goes on there. If a few people lose their homes and their livelihoods as fishermen, nobody really bats an eyelid. And that is just the reality of how we live now, the kind of scale of things. We see that there's something needs to be sacrificed. And it's, for example, a kind of something that comes up with the discussions around compensation as well, ecological compensation. There should be sacrifice certain areas and then protect others in order to kind of somehow keep some kind of a balance. And it always kind of, for me, it raises the question of who are the we to make these kinds of choices. And like she writes, sharing legal status is one thing, sharing resources is quite another. And that is something that becomes very clear with mining projects, for example. That is quite, yes, we all have apparently, at least in Nordic countries, very good legal rights, but it seems to be that some people's rights are sort of way more than other people's rights. And this particularly comes very, very clear when we look at the Sami territories and up north, across the Nordic countries. The Sami, as our kind of indigenous people in these lands, are walked over constantly by the states and also these sort of international mining companies, for example, now. There is an old series from Maria Helander called Nickel that is on the kind of from the Russian side of the border up north, of these big mining areas, industrial areas. More kind of recent, still ongoing of course, is the Arctic Railway project that I'm sure the governments will keep on, it will come up to the agenda again and again, because the interest is in developing a railroad to the Arctic, opening Arctic shipping routes and for the mining interests connected there. And here's, for example, Jenny Leiden from Taru, who's been very active in the activism, and where art and activism come completely together in resisting this. Or, for example, Elos Teatron Moratorio, there was a moratorium that is still ongoing. I was stood on an island of Teno River, where basically there was a project of protecting the river, the salmon of the river, with a legal change that would have disallowed the local Sami to continue their traditional fishing, but it would have allowed for the tourists to be sold licenses to fish the salmon. And the Sami were very, there were a lot of artists involved in this, and there's a number of artworks that have been also multi-kind of disciplinary artworks that have come out of this. So the question kind of, now I get to the questions that, with mining companies, I also learned in the weekend a number of pretty kind of horrendous examples of how the mining companies usually do their own environmental impact assessments. Then the local authorities look through these assessments and think, oh, this all looks fine, stamp of approval. And it really seems to be a kind of practice that happens a lot, also in other countries. So I was thinking of how should we start doing our own environmental impact assessments, and maybe with more sort of ethical backbone than it sounds like some of these mining companies are doing this assessment with. So what are the questions that we should be asking them, for example? For example, that how does the knowledge and value produced in and through our work, does it reinforce or challenge the unsustainable structures that make the society today? How can we make informed choices and to acknowledge the environmental and social impact of our work? And are there alternatives, or are we really in that sort of neoliberal era of no alternatives? Are we actually kind of, should we rethink of how we work? In my own work, because I mainly worked with contemporary visual arts, a lot of site-specific kind of research-based projects, I've been thinking for years now about these sort of questions around site sensitivity and how do we go somewhere. So let's say that if we think of within the performing arts, that if we think of, if we want to get out of those frameworks, like in the visual arts, artists are moving away from the gallery settings, particularly artists who are working with environmental questions, and have been doing that for a long time. But then when we go to other contexts, what do our engagements do and leave behind? How do we gain access? How do we who grants us access? How can we assume to have access to all of these places, to all the knowledge, to communities, that we can use as material for our artwork? Who and what do these our artworks serve? And can they actually have any local impacts or global effects beyond the value production in the sphere of the international art world, for example? Another question connected to this is a question about international mobility that has been taken as a kind of, it's been taken for granted as a good thing, that we are very international. It's very much part of the kind of career development. And now, of course, when we're looking at how mobility, it's getting a lot more complicated. How do we, first of all, this is like, I don't really believe that we should always start with the carbon footprint, because I think that hides a lot of things. I think we need to think about carbon footprint, but I think we need to think about a lot of complex ecological questions together with the carbon footprint. But with flying, the carbon footprint is a pretty big issue that one has to that we have to prioritize. When do we really actually have to go somewhere and want to go somewhere? What is the value of that? But then, also with mobility now, we're kind of at the time of a lot of forced migration. And with climate crisis, it's just going to get worse. So who has actually access to this kind of global circulation? It's still like within, for example, artist residencies, the statistics are staggering. It's huge majority of the artists who are traveling around are from the Western countries, they're from Europe and from North America. So we have a lot of privilege, so we're not necessarily very aware of always. But also, like, what kind of processes of value production does this international circulation take part in the end? And in the end, what is the cost of being on the move? Environmentally, socially, personally, intellectually? Following Taru's 3 ecologies, it has it weighs on all of this. We have to consider all of those. But then beyond thinking about our sort of human social circles, we have to, of course, also think now beyond the human. I think about the more than human. I wouldn't necessarily say they're both human. I think there's so many words for this. I like the more than human because other than human, somehow others, everybody but human. And Donna Haraway's thinking, of course, has been here very important. And emphasizing that how no species, not even our own arrogant one, pretending to be good individuals in so-called modern Western scripts, acts alone. The assemblages of organic species and of abiotic access make history. The evolutionary kind and the other kinds too, like we heard in the first presentation today. So these kind of assemblages, we are part of the forest. We're definitely very entangled, but there are kind of dark aspects to this entanglement, for sure. But how do we, then what she asked, I think this is really crucial, that it matters which stories tell stories, and which concepts think concepts. It really matters of kind of what are those narratives, what are those our methods, what are those our traditions that we actually kind of are part of when we're telling these stories, and engaging or trying to make sense of what is happening today. Let's see if I get this working. So there's different ways of the artists are listening to, or trying to kind of shift focus and listen to, for example, plants. These are short demo, not a finished work, a short demo of Peltomaitikka, plant that only thrives at the moment anymore in meadows on the island of Seili in Turku-Archipelago, where I'm working at the moment. So that's Peltomaitikka there, yeah. And Kalle Ram has been together with a band of weeds, collaborating with a number of plants, and particularly with Peltomaitikka as part of the series that they're researching now is into plants that are kind of on the move because of climate crisis, and there's different kinds of processes of protecting or trying to kind of trying to also maybe kind of support their migration in ways that they would otherwise just become extinct in different places. But what comes up with this, I thought it was kind of interesting as well to think about how the questions that came with this dark entanglement, for me, was the kind of questions of consent. And Carlo was saying recently that how often, and actually I've witnessed one of these things, when he was showing how he used this sort of technology that some of you probably know, where basically it connects to the different kinds of fluids that are moving in the plant. So in the end, actually kind of the sound is of the plant's engagement with fluidly with its environment. So it's the different minerals and so on that are coming and going in the plant that actually is making the sound or translated into sound. But like one of the questions that came up after one of his presentations was that they said, how do we ask consent? How do we actually, when we involve a plant, for example, in live performance like they do in Band of Weeds, how do you, what kind of right do we have to kind of get this plant to perform? And I think that's really interesting because then it kind of course leads to the question of how should I ask consent of the lettuce in my fridge, before I eat it? This sort of, it's sort of curious that when you start performing, or when you get a plant, for example, to perform in an artwork, it becomes an individual in a way that somehow we start thinking about as a co-producer of the work that has certain kind of rights and agency that we should somehow take into consideration. And but that somehow doesn't apply to that lettuce in our fridge. And I think that's kind of an interesting of kind of what kind of shifts are needed in our thinking in order for us to move to that more than human kind of way of thinking. Another project that we think of is that I've been working with an artist recently, an architect researcher who's been working, this is research material from eels. Eels only reproduce in Sargasso Sea, in the kind of on the US side of the Atlantic. So all the European eels have to migrate over there to reproduce, and then these little guys come back, from at the bottom of the Atlantic. They come back, and these guys have been caught up in Gloucestershire somewhere in the UK, where they actually, for conservation efforts, they catch some of these who come back to the kind of environments of their parents, basically, and they're kind of caught and also transported to a number of Nordic countries, where they're replanted into our lakes and rivers, where they can't get to anymore naturally because of all the rivers have been dammed by hydropower dams. So most rivers in Europe are inaccessible for eels, for example, today. They can't migrate back anymore. They can't migrate out and they can't migrate back. And so there's conservation efforts on kind of assisted migration, on actually bringing these little ones back and then putting them on a lake where they can never actually leave from there anymore. So this is the level of kind of entanglement that we have with our environment, and the questions around how in complex ways we are kind of creating these kind of barriers. Let's say hydropower is renewable energy, but it's actually causing this kind of environmental kind of catastrophes to local ecosystems that we are then trying to patch up, but actually kind of they were flown to Sweden to a quarantine for 3 months or something before they were then taken to these different lakes. So how do we deal with all of this? What Isabel Stengner's calls for is cosmopolitics, and for us to imagine a politics where we could somehow make decisions in the presence of all of those who will bear the consequences. Not only humans, but the divergent worlds they belong to. What could be this decision making? How do we listen to? How can we somehow make sense of and assess the impacts of these decisions? And what she writes about a lot is about slow science and calling for science to slow down. Because the only way by slowing down we can actually start trying to assess and think of these kind of complex entanglements. That at the moment where there is also, with the climate crisis, the kind of contradiction is that of course we need fast and efficient solutions, which is, stated everywhere. But at the same time, the science are actually telling us that there's so much more that we need to know before we can make this sort of techno fixes, for example, safely, and so on. So how do we become somehow able to respond to what our work adds to the world, like she writes? And this is where she brings up the kind of question of ecology of practices. That how do we think about practices, but also these sort of multidisciplinary practices? How can we think of them as sort of not just in terms of what they are, but actually as what they may become, or as they are becoming something? With the climate crisis, there's a lot of emphasis on multidisciplinarity, and we need a lot more dialogue between different disciplines, because not a single science can actually give us a whole picture anymore. Like the biologists, for example, are kind of saying more and more that we really need to work across those disciplinary boundaries in order to understand the complexities of what's at stake. And I think that's where it also becomes really interesting for us to think about where does the art fit in and how do we work. But how do we then work if we think of shifting our own practices as kind of, in a way, something that is always in becoming. and then also take that as a lead for thinking about how do we approach other practices then in terms of collaboration. Like she writes about how we should be approaching a practice. I guess also in terms of our own practice, but also other practices. As they diverge, feeding their borders and experimenting with questions that practitioners may accept as relevant, even if they are not their own questions. So rather than this kind of creating this sort of mobilization and a kind of boundary being built as a defense against the outside, we should be finding different ways of somehow kind of negotiating those boundaries. Going to the post-human that Rosa Braidotti has written about, very important work, feminist sort of post-humanist work. What I find there is really sort of valuable is the sort of emphasis on kind of on practice, that we need to focus on sort of developing new genealogies and alternative representations of the sort of new kinship system. And we need new narratives, we need new theoretical or legal frameworks. But this is not a kind of something like a doxa, like she writes, but this is actually a grounded shared project. This has to be collective. This has to be kind of based on non-profit experimentation. That's really something that really works towards something in a sort of multifaceted relationality. And I've been recently also thinking of how we might look at what is happening now with the Extinction Rebellion, with all its problems, as we know also, but how different forms of art have been literally taken to the street in extremely kind of performative actions of blocking the kind of business as usual in London, for example. What can we learn from that in a way? How a lot of different practitioners are actually joining together from this, like professors of law, gluing themselves to the Houses of Parliament and so on. So there's a kind of an artist and environmentalist together. Also, what I think is important to kind of really think of how the three, or there's actually the four now claims that they have, the kind of key claims, are obviously to do with climate emergency and carbon neutrality, but also the third one is citizen assembly. They're kind of calling for us to form citizen assemblies, to kind of return, to recreate sort of democratic structures and processes to deal with what's at stake. And this is especially connected to the kind of call for just transition. So the transition to kind of ecological future, kind of a sustainable future, has to also somehow recognize sort of different stakes in a way. I've been thinking of these sort of different activist histories and thinking about how do we move forward and how we might learn from the past, also. Because I don't believe that we are going to that we can go past, it's not about regression, kind of cutting off all tech, and going past, somehow return to some sort of nostalgic, past when things were better, but actually learning from different kinds of histories that have been nearly forgotten, but now are actually re-emerging. Like, for example, Green and Common Women's Peace Camp. It was a really interesting reference, that in the early 80s, was big news because it was mainly women camping out against a kind of nuclear military sort of base by NATO in the UK. And so there's kind of connections to power, imperialism, power and different kinds of technologies, and was very much present there. But also what was kind of very key to their movement, like a lot of the peace and environmental movements in the 70s and 80s, was a real focus on collectivity and the kind of rethinking of how do we work collectively, and how emphasizing these different processes, kind of everyday maintenance of kind of how do we feed all of us, how do we kind of really have equal possibility of somehow staking our claim. and voicing our concerns in these processes. And so kind of to end nearly, I will sort of emphasize more this sort of sense of collectivity and commons, and how necessary it is for us to really understand, to think of how can we kind of reconstruct in a way our lives around commoning our relations with others, including animals, waters, plants and mountains. Like, Silvia Federici writes, that which the large-scale construction of robots will certainly destroy. So I've got a feeling that the kind of the fridge that will tell me if I need to buy more milk is not going to save. It's not going to actually kind of somehow protect me in the future. The way that we need some other kind of measures. And Federici's work is really important in rethinking the kind of way that how power operates today. And how we need to kind of, in a way, look in the histories to understand how we've got here, where we are now, but also look at those different sort of moments in histories of how people have worked against these destructive processes. And then some questions to the end. Are we going to be part of the solution or part of the problem? Amitav Ghosh, in this book, The Great Derangement, he writes about, particularly asks the question of why novel, why literature has not been able to tackle the climate crisis. And it's a very interesting way how he opens it up. He's an Indian author, writer, novelist, and he writes a lot about that kind of history of how modernity, in a way, the kind of Western modernity, there was a number of different kinds of modernities taking place, but how a particular form of Western modernity, in a way, took over, as he claims, to kind of largely connected to the kind of imperialism and capitalism. But how also the climate crisis is connected to and caused by not just capitalism, but actually very much imperialism, history of imperialism, and how power is dependent on fossil fuels, and how the sort of status quo, nothing will change if we let the status quo decide that, because they need the things to go on as they are. But what's kind of interesting for us, I think, working in the arts, is this question of how do we, how can, for example, novel, even now when the modern novel has been, a serious fiction, as he says, has been kind of very much focused on the everyday, the individual moral journey, the kind of linearity of time, and very much focused through observation on creating a scene that we can somehow relate to as kind of real, of where the kind of different interactions of the characters happen. And he claims that it's within this sort of framework of the novel, it's really difficult, for example, to narrate the kind of complex connections between a local specific site and scene, and the kind of global kind of processes and forces that actually the kind of butterfly effect, how it's connected. And so, if we think of now, you think of literature that is referring to climate crisis or writing about environmental catastrophes, they are usually science fiction. They are kind of seen as, they are kind of categorized as science fiction or magical realism or one of these other kind of, and actually the Western notion of, our notion of modern novel cannot somehow sort of, in a way, it doesn't have the tools somehow to tackle with this. And so these questions around the kind of our notions of time and space in how we narrate stories, I think this kind of really relates quite closely also to any kind of narration, whether it's happening in the visual arts, in video, for example, or in fiction and documentary, but also in theatre, of course. How do we, how does that kind of those sort of tools that we have and traditions that we have, how do they actually allow us to really narrate and imagine otherwise these situations, or even just to narrate what is actually happening today? One thing that he also really emphasizes is that the avant-garde, the notion of the avant-garde, is very problematic for this. And the avant-garde now seems to be not seeing what's right in front of its eyes, which is the climate catastrophe. But also the notion of freedom the autonomy of the arts and the kind of limitlessness of human freedom. Like he writes that insofar as the limitlessness of human freedom is central to the arts of our time, this is also where the Anthropocene will most intransigently resist them. There are limits to our freedom. There are very real material limits to our kind of freedom. Maybe not in terms of imagination, but I would say that there seems to be quite a lot of limits to our imagination today as well, at least in the Western world, in terms of how can we imagine that moving forward from this current situation. But maybe this is somewhere to discuss with a Taru about the background. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Taru. Do we give applause already? Quite a package. Just do you have like immediate questions or notions to Taru after this?
I can what you think, you can see there's a little stream there. It was quite big. And I think that's the first time that I've seen something that I've really understood what poison green means as a color. It was literally a poison green liquid that was flowing from those piles of rock into one of these pools. But that was the only place where they hadn't managed to build a kind of a high enough wall of rock in between the road and the pools. But it's a reality that we are all part of. The green goo.
There's some kind of unfinished view coming out of here now, but I try to connect to many things what you said. But I was thinking about this that you were talking about this because there was this kind of evident dystopian like perspective, and it can be like depressing, but you were talking about these possible practices, which is somehow the key to at least trying to imagine differently. That's what I'm like receiving after this different perspective of how to see and locate and also how you're building the relationship to the history of seeing how we ended up in these kind of discussions or scenarios or reality actually. So yeah, this possibility of art to harness the possibility of imagination, also to find the possible futures, even though the sum of the past are already like a closing off. But in this kind of situation, this is kind of just like I'm thinking a lot about that possibility, and during the presentation I was thinking very much about the exhibition of the two Finnish artists, the Terry Haapoja and Laura Gustafsson, and especially their project, the history of the cattle. In a way of course, it's you could say that there is a convention of exhibiting this kind of making an exhibition, but because it's having using this kind of frame of the historical narrative in a way to try to discuss on how the cattle and the cow is part of our culture. So it's then to me one like a tiny little example of how you can imagine and how you try to like to somehow deconstruct these kind of narratives and fixations, how we are relating to things. So I see that kind of as an example of this kind of artistic creativity to imagine in another way.
Yeah, I think, sorry if I think I probably brought a lot of the Talvivaara kind of weight with me, from the last week, you know, kind of dystopian, you know, it's something that I feel even more now than I usually do. But, you know, I guess I've also become a bit of a prophet of doom, you know, my role in the different discussions is to kind of bring the kind of environmental crisis facts to the table, and then everybody's goes on. And obviously the real difficulty is that we need to recognize what's really at stake, but also we need to somehow find ways of engaging that doesn't, you know, I think there's a lot of denial that actually is happening not through stupidity or evilness, but just the kind of fact that it's so difficult to be, you know, engage with these questions, and also there doesn't seem to be much kind of, we don't usually get a sense that there's something we can do. You know, so you read the news and you feel more and more kind of depressed, you know, but you have no sense of what you can do about it. And so I think that's also something that really got me thinking about how important it is to think about practices on a level of practice and on a level of what is it that we actually do and how we're doing things. So things of everyday practices in our work are really crucial in terms of, like, I think that now actually there's a lot of extremely interesting work around care and around kind of trying to think of different ways of this sort of collectivity and how do we actually start practicing our relations to each other and to our work and to the world in different ways, and start kind of imagining, recognizing kind of problematics, you know, within our kind of structures within which we operate, and then actively start, you know, kind of undoing those to actually doing things otherwise, you know. And somehow, although it might seem at a very minute, sort of small scale level, it's still, you know, it really does have an impact. Like this gathering in Kaidani, you know, I think what was really amazing about that was the sense that there were so many people who are really actively working on these issues, but also really kind of investing a lot of effort into being attentive to each other and attentive to different sort of the environments and all those who have a stake in these spaces where they work. So it requires a kind of slowing down of our work in a way, but actually intensifying our awareness of what is there, you know, what is part of our work somehow, and how we do things.
Actually, that slowing down was other kind of interesting notion that you made, and I link it also because I'm also asking that despite of the fact that we need imagination and how the knowledge is located to that, but this slowing down is I think it's helping that you have time to create some kind of knowledge, or try to at least try to understand this complex constellation of different kind of data and information, which is some of it is like they go in different directions.
Yeah, and I think that's you know, it's really exciting as well. You know, that's where somebody asked me at some point, kind of, where do you find joy in your work? I was like, yeah, you know, it's sometimes a bit tough, you know, when I start with reading the environmental news the first thing in the morning. But it comes from the kind of, it does really comes from the kind of those discussions with people. But it's kind of taking the time to really kind of think together, and also to go out there. You know, it's kind of, it is really, I think it's really important to deal with these urgencies actually outside of the seminar room and to kind of actually somehow get reconnected to our environment in different ways. I think that practice of actually really trying to think of how do we, you know, and just paying attention through deep listening, other modes of kind of actually being somehow present and aware of our environments in different ways. I think that there's a kind of lot there, but I think that kind of business as usual, breaking down in different ways is the kind of starting point at least for things. Yeah. Any other kind of questions that everybody's hopefully torn with?
Yeah, no, of course we can already, you can link your questions to the previous presentations. But
Joris was waving your hand. That was
yeah, thanks by the way for the pressing talk. Because clearly when you talk about relevance and wondering what we're doing, this should be awareness all the time. At the same time, we're all struggling, of course, with the question, indeed, whether you're part of the problem or part of the solution. And you were mentioning commons, and quite recently I saw an interesting lecture by somebody explaining how commons work, which is a very old way of organizing communities and having something in common. And I realized that he was talking to a group of artists about this idea of organizing through commons. And the very first questions that came out of the room, which again, we're all artists, were like, yeah, but if I organize myself in terms of a common group, what about authorship, and what about my income, and how do I finance then my practice? So it made so painfully clear that this rethinking goes all the way. I mean, like fundamentally all the way. It's not just what can I do as an artist, but it's you realize you're part of the problem because you're part of a system that, of course, is working with this capitalist principle. So I was curious whether you have found examples where this idea of rethinking how you organize and rethinking what you feel is something to share rather than own. Yeah, if you see examples of that through your work.
I think there is a lot of examples, and I think there's always been. There's a lot of the work now around these questions is sort of big artists are taking very intentionally taking kind of collective names for themselves. They don't even like act in their own names often, but actually kind of as a collective entity. Often artists working with these sort of practices are also very connected to a land. So that's something that we can learn from the Sami and the indigenous, but also from many contemporary artists from different fields. You know, there's a sense that yes, these are global issues and we're networked globally, but actually, you know, what I can do is do something right here. And then if the practice, if this means that the artist is connected, working with a very, very local context for decades, they definitely don't internationalize in a way that, you know, they would have like a, you know, that particular kind of artist career, because there also usually means that the work, this sort of long-term commitments and engagements don't produce work as projects that could be then fed into the kind of the system in a way that will be recognized as works that can be shown in a museum or in a gallery or in a biennale or in a theatre or in a festival. But now that recently there's been a lot of focus on these kind of practices, and I think a lot of very long-term committed, grounded practices have now become recognized as models. So I think there's a lot you can find in all fields, I would imagine. I have noticed that in now working with the University of the Arts with this ecological questions, it's been also really interesting to notice how, for example, the visual arts are still very individualistic or kind of very much focused on the individual practice. There isn't in Finland a strong emphasis and move towards collective practices in contemporary arts than there are actually in some other places. And I wonder why and what are the structures here that are somehow not allowing that to happen the same way. I think in performing arts it's different, of course, because there is a kind of the work is sort of collective based to start with somehow more. But I think also what's happening now, what I've noticed is that there's also artists that these collectives often are quite multidisciplinary, so they don't very easily fit into any arts disciplinary sort of systems and frameworks either, because you can have artists and practitioners, you know, scientists, you know, architects, and coming from different practices and actually working together. So I think there's these kinds of examples I would look for definitely. And I think the notion of commons is extremely interesting. We have to start from also understanding of how the whole notion of property and ownership is at the core of the kind of issues today with everything. From very kind of pragmatic legal shit to do with like mining projects, for example, to who has the rights to that bit of land and how they can be reclaimed or claimed, to actually how we're working out. And they're really tricky. But I think there's a lot of people now really creating actively alternative models of operating.
I really love how you say that to commit to a local place for longer term, and then maybe slow down also because of it.
And I think that's where the value of these our technologies, we have to recognize that it doesn't mean that we go off-grid. We can have very strong connections to the world, to actually like-minded practitioners. And I think finding ways of doing this sustainably, to actually be really grounded, but also have those strong connections is really crucial today, because we can't, with climate crisis, you cannot understand the impact of your own work from a sort of enclosed space or context. Because everything is still having this sort of wider sort of impacts.
Yes, I was thinking about, it was really intriguing, the idea of the consent. So you should ask for consent, like in the case of the blend of the bees, because it struck me that a lot of the bioarts is operating on that area, and it's kind of parallel development of this like digital interconnectedness that we are in now. So that it seems to me that a lot of the practices of the bioarts, they are this same kind of data extraction in a sense. So if you have this, your species of choice or your performer of choice, and then you are extracting the data out of it, and it's really like resembling a lot of this like gathering the big data and kind of programming people to operate in certain ways. But on the other hand, it's giving a voice to something that really hasn't like a unique voice or independent voice, so that it's, again, we are in this area of big problems in a sense, so that this is like exploitative practice in a sense, but it's for the good, so that how do you kind of balance yourself within that problematics.
I think it is a kind of the Haraway staying with the trouble it really captures it all. I think that's where we are. There's no way out of that. You can be militantly vegan and never fly anywhere and only walk and cycle, but you will still have a kind of carbon footprint, and you might actually, by your choices, you might also be kind of supporting some negative processes without realizing. Because things are so extremely complex, so I think kind of accepting that whatever we do is a compromise somehow, but actually trying to at least be aware of what those, what are those different implications of our choices. I think, obviously it's very clear that we should all be vegans when you look at the data, but at the same time, for example, this Beltomaitica is a good example of a plant that would not exist most likely without cows. And so there's on the islands in Archipelago, they've had cattle for centuries. There's been people there with having very small scale farming for centuries, literally 500-600 years at least. And so what they've done for all that time was to take the cattle, the cows and the sheep to different islands in the summer for summer grazing. And so actually when that practice stopped, when intensive agriculture started spreading everywhere in Finland after the Second World War, in particular 60s, 70s, a lot of these ecosystems started kind of really being affected by the fact that they didn't have cows and sheep there anymore in the summer months. So a lot of the species of plants were lost, and the biodiversity was going down. And so, for example, the Beltomaitica is there now, thriving on this one island, because they've been actively, as a conservation measure, bringing cows back onto the island in the summer months. And that has kind of regenerated the sort of that local ecosystem. But of course you can say that this is a bit like kind of somehow holding on to a past, or sort of course environments are changing constantly. But these are very, very dramatic changes when these sorts of changes happen, like a cut, when one species, like a cow, is basically taken out of the equation completely. And what happens in this process is a lot of biodiversity loss. A lot of species are lost, and usually certain species dominate. And so it's a really complex issue. So it's a bit like this, these eels being kind of flown over to lakes in Finland. But it seems insane. But of course, these eels are part of the ecosystem, but we don't even know how complex their role is for other species within those ecosystems. So it's a bit like, that's where it's everything is so extremely complexly entangled, and these interdependencies, we only know, even the scientists now only kind of the surface of the complex interdependencies in all these ecosystems today, after all.
I think I suggest that we move to the main academy to see the Kalle Rasinkangas installation, and there is Taru also waiting 7:30. So thanks for the discussion, and we can continue discussion unofficially, and we continue definitely tomorrow. So thank you.
Tomi, Vitosen näyttely. Oli meidän alkunäitä varten 8 asti Vitosperuksessa. Mitäs pitää olla sen näyttelyt? Ne
okay.
lukee siellä ohjelmassakin nimittäin.
Okay. So fifth floor in the academy, there's also an exhibition on the fifth floor.
Yeah.
It's for this seminar. This is the coursework of the second year students.
Third year.
Third year. Ideasta teokseksi it's called, from idea to the work or the piece. So
From idea to realization.
A realization is
Yeah.
the English version. Okay. So please go and see and experience that too, as well as the Kalle's exhibition. So yeah, thank you.
Uudestaan.
Aina voi tapahtua.